Anyone ever heard this story before? A few of you. This will amaze you. Now, talking about the mind and what can happen if we have an impaired part of the mind. 25-year-old Phineas Gage. He was a Vermont railroad worker. And he was a foreman, and this is actually a picture of him. He was a foreman, and he would work with a 3-foot-long, 14-pound tamping iron. And his job was to, as a foreman, when they were clearing for the railroads, they would go through all these rugged terrain, and they would have to drill these holes down into the rock and dump this type of powder, gunpowder down in there, and they'd put a charge in there, they'd pack it with sand, everybody would get away, and it'd blow up the rock, they'd clear it, and they did that for day in, day out, day in, day out. One day something happened, and Phineas didn't realize that the order of things hadn't happened properly. And his job was to do the final packing. And unfortunately, nobody put the packing sand in. And when he went down and he struck the side of that rock, there was no packing sand. It sparked and it exploded. In fact, the rod was propelled through his skull. It went right up through his cheek and right out the top of his head. It landed, some say, approximately 100 feet behind him. Boom! Pow! And he just slumped over. Boom. You want to know what's amazing about the story? He lived to tell about it. Incredible. It had affected the front part of the brain, which is called the frontal lobe. And this weekend, we are going to talk a lot about the frontal lobe. Dr. Harlow, this was his attending physician. Here's what he said. This is his actual skull here. Actually, you can go see it in the museum now if you want. And you can notice on his forehead here, you can see that there's a little cap that's missing. Well, it blew this little cap off, and it damaged the back of the orbital socket, and it damaged his whole forehead. He still lived to tell about it. Here's what his attending physician, Dr. Harlow, wrote. He wrote, Gage was fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, listen, which was not previously his custom. Before he was known as an upright man, a Christian man, someone that esteemed his friends and his fellows better than others. And he was just a great upright man. Impatient of restraint or advice when it conflicted with his desires. A child in his intellectual capacity and manifestations, he has the animal passions of a strong man. Previous to his injury, although untrained in the schools, he possessed a well-balanced mind. So the reality is, he was radically changed. His character was changed, and he went from being a normal, happy, healthy guy to having fits of rage. In fact, after this, he didn't even want to hang out with his friends anymore. And he engaged in this grossest profanity, eventually left the church and left his wife, and went on and joined a circus as a freak act. Neurologist Dr. Paul MacLean wrote this concerning the limbic lobes. Now, understand we were just starting to talk about the frontal lobe. We'll come back to that in just a moment. But there's another section of the brain called the limbic system. The limbic lobes regulate the emotions concerned with the 4 primal or base instincts. For instance, before the injury of Phineas Gage, if someone came up and provoked him, no problem. Because the limbic lobes didn't take over because they were subject to the properly functioning frontal lobe. Because the frontal lobe is the control center. Does that make sense? This is key, friends. The frontal lobe is the control center. So what happens in a healthy frontal moral lobe, it will, if someone provokes you and you say, no, I need to back away and be Christ-like here. The challenge is, if we have an inhibited frontal lobe and someone provokes us, then we rise right back and we might want to fight. Or we might want to take off in the light of responsibility. We also might just want to be a glutton, and when it says you need to stop, the frontal lobe says, Christian, whoa, you've been eating quite a bit here. No. I want to eat because I want to eat, and I'll just feed because the limbic lobes take over. And understand, this is a kind of a large brushstroke of how this all works, but for our purposes, this will serve. Or fornication, another primal or base instinct, as the doctor calls it. So what happens in a frontal moral lobe that is damaged If he wants to go off and fornicate, he will, because the frontal lobe's not saying, no, wait a minute, you're married, you're a Christian, you don't do that. In this regard, Phineas Gage's mind was radically changed, so decidedly that his friends and acquaintances said he was no longer Gage. We don't know who this guy is anymore. Have you ever said about your young person, maybe a spouse, maybe a family member, I don't even know who this guy is anymore. I don't even know who, my children, parents come up to me and go, why do you think my children are such brats? Whoa, I don't know. I mean, that's kind of a big question. My kids are so rebellious. My kids are so afraid. They go down this whole list. And before you know it, we can sit down and do a little interview with them. And then it's not hard to reason from cause to effect that these kids are sitting here listening to all the stuff of rebellion. And by beholding, they're becoming changed. It's really not rocket science. It's how the mind works. So the battle is truly for the mind. And since the devil cannot give us a frontal lobotomy, that's what that's called, a lobotomy, removal of a certain lobe of the brain, since he can't give us a frontal lobotomy, like he did with Gage, if you will, he's invented many other ways that can basically do the same thing. And guess what? Certain kinds of music will basically give us a frontal lobotomy.